All right, here's like my third or fourth attempt to get your waste reduction methods notes together. So here we go. The first method to reduce the amount of waste, especially the amount of waste we're putting into landfills, is remember there's a finite space on the planet. Can't go putting trash everywhere. Is recycling. So recycling is a process where you take solid waste materials and you recreate them or you process them and convert them into new products. Some of the more commonly recyclable materials are glass, paper, cardboard, metal, plastic, tires. Though tires have to be recycled in a specific facility. Textiles, those are things like cloth, rugs, anything made of fabric, and electronics. The best thing about recycling is that it can reduce our demand on producing new materials or locating new minerals or cutting down trees. All of that saves energy, which also can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What are the drawbacks? Well, it can be energy intensive and costly depending on the material. Some materials are easier to recycle than others, and some can be recycled into the same item, like metal or aluminum cans, can very easily be recycled into brand new aluminum cans. It's actually more cost effective to recycle and make aluminum cans through recycling than it is to go out, locate new aluminum ore, and process it and then churn it into cans. Other materials, though, it's very difficult or it's expensive to recycle them, and it's not possible or not easy to try and produce something like the original product. So they're reused to make new, different products. So, for example, paper can be recycled to make cardboard or to make toilet paper. This process is called downcycling. So you recycle your waste into a new product, usually a product of lower quality, so lower economic value as well. And this also limits the amount of times you can reuse this material before it ultimately needs to be discarded. So, an example here is paper that gets recycled into cardboard, that gets recycled into toilet paper, which is not recycled and ends up being discarded. The biggest materials where this is a problem is plastic and paper. What's going to happen when you put something in for recycling is it's going to be collected. Here in the city of Dallas, we do have curbside recycling pickup and recycle bins that are shaped just like this. Then it's going to be transported to a sorting center where the materials will be sorted into, cans, glass, paper, etc. Then it's going to be cleaned and processed, though there is the caveat that you should put clean materials in for recycling instead of putting dirty materials in. That way you don't risk things getting too contaminated to be able to use. And then finally you produce a new product. Plastics are kind of an issue. So plastics have the capability to be recycled, but in reality, only about a quarter of the plastic that is produced is currently being recycled. There's also usually a limit to the amount of times you can recycle plastic. The polymers that make up this plastic tend to break down during the recycling process, making it more difficult to use them to produce new things. Some objects can be melted and recycled to produce other objects. Some can be converted to monomers, broken down into smaller units, and those can be reused to create new objects. So here are some plastic pellets produced from recycling that can then be used to make new products. And then some waste plastic can be converted to fuel oil because remember, originally plastics were made from petroleum products. In about 2050, it's estimated we'll have about 12 billion tons of plastic. Um, that's not going to be recycled. So about 37% of it gets incinerated, about 37% of it gets disposed of. And that really doesn't help because plastics aren't biodegradable. There aren't decomposers that break down plastics into less harmful chemicals. Usually they just get broken down into tiny pieces, aka microplastics, which I've talked about, and these can contaminate all living things. In the United States, we tend to label our plastic products with numbers 1 through 7 to indicate what type of plastic they are, and that also helps you determine whether it's recyclable in your area. For example, I don't think in the city of Dallas we recycle type 7 or type 4. Type 4 is grocery bags, so you have to put them in a different place for recycling. You can't just put them in your recycling bin. The most commonly recycled types of plastic are types 1 and 2. Type 1 is soft drink and water bottles, and type 2 are milk jugs and laundry detergent bottles, those harder plastic bottles. Where does your recycling go once you put it in the recycle bin? Well, unfortunately, it was a process of let's pass on our problem to somebody else. So it was cheaper just to ship a lot of our recyclable materials to China. Some of it did end up getting recycled, but some of it may have been burned or landfilled. And then in 2018, China decided, we're not going to take everyone's recycling anymore. So they banned the import of recycling from other countries. This is what you see in this graph here. Um, this is countries exporting their recycling to China. Notice Japan was doing a lot of it, the US was doing a lot of it, and then a lot of other countries as well. By 2018, this stream decreased to very close to zero because most of the recyclable materials um, aren't able to be shipped there. Unfortunately, some countries took this to say, okay, we need to develop our own domestic recycling processes and plants, and others decided, well, we're just going to ship this recycling to other countries. Several countries have since outlawed the import of recyclables, especially plastics, and others have more relaxed regulations, so the plastic often gets burned or it gets dumped somewhere. E-waste recycling is very important. E-waste is the fastest category of solid waste, fastest growing category in the world. So of e-waste, it looks like about 28% is computers, about 37% is phones, 12% is air conditioning, about 9% is washing machines, and about 14% is television sets. And what you're seeing here is basically the components. So, for example, for mobile phones, about 42% of that is plastic, 23% of that is PCBs, those polychloral biphenyls, 12% is the screens, 2% is made of magnets. So, these are all the materials that you can, if you recycle or try to salvage, you can try to recover these materials from e-waste. Annually, the planet right now generates about 50 million metric tons of e-waste, which adds up to about 7 kilograms per person on the planet. Less than a quarter of that is recycled properly, but we can reduce the amount of e-waste by recycling and reuse. So if there are companies that take old products and try and extract usable components, that's good because if you don't dispose of these properly, they can leach out chemicals like lead and mercury, especially if they leach out from landfills into groundwater that can contaminate water supplies. Composting is another way to reduce solid waste. You take food waste, any kind of scraps, yard trimmings, sometimes paper, and you let it decompose under specific conditions that will let it decompose aerobically. That means that that is, remember, with oxygen, and that is going to produce CO2 as a byproduct, which is better than producing methane as a byproduct. That decomposes the organic material to form compost, also known as humus, which is, if you remember from soil, a component of rich and fertile soil. And then you can take that compost and sell it as fertilizer or use it as fertilizer if you compost at home. There are conditions that need to be met. You do need bacteria from the soil, fungus, sometimes worms are used as well to help break things down. You also need a mix of what's called green waste and brown waste. These are, things like leaves, grass, and food scraps are green waste. And then brown waste is more woody materials, things like paper, wood chips, yard trimmings as well. Otherwise, it doesn't turn into good compost, it kind of turns into a sludge. As of right now, compostable materials make up about 20% of what's in the landfill. And since it's being uh, degraded anaerobically, meaning without oxygen, it actually takes a lot longer to break down in a landfill than it would in a compost pile. So, composting can reduce the volume of what we're putting in our landfills, and it can also reduce the methane emissions from landfills as well. The drawbacks, though, do include odor. It is stuff that is decomposing, as well as the potential to attract pests like rodents. There's also industrial composting facilities that can take more materials than can be used in people's composting at home. So, for instance, you're not supposed to compost bones, grease, dairy products, or meat because either it can attract very smelly bacteria or it can also attract scavengers. But industrial composting facilities can handle this. They can also handle compostable plastic, which does actually break down under composting conditions. This is different from recycling. These compostable plastics are usually plant-based plastics. And it's a really cool way to try and replace the non-degradable plastic that we use a lot today. Some industrial composting companies can pick up compost, like, they do trash and recycling pickup. Others will have collection bins, some in grocery stores, some in other locations. And then they take the finished compost that's produced at the end and sell it to farmers as fertilizer. All right, so landfill mitigation strategies. Mitigation is when you reduce the negative consequences of something. In the case of our course, it's reducing the negative environmental consequences of something. One thing you can do is incinerate or burn waste for energy, which decreases the volume of trash that's going into the landfill. Or you can restore the habitat where a landfill was by covering it with soil. And in some cases, that's been used to make parks. So, this is a famous area in Spain outside of Barcelona where there was a large landfill and they gradually allowed native plants to start seeding the area, and they've grown it into a park-like area. Eventually, I believe the plan is for it to join a local national park. So, former waste area is now going to become part of a national park. This allows you to use these former landfill sites for other purposes. Of course, it's very important that the landfill is sealed and not allowed to leak chemicals because that could cause contamination. And just so you get an idea of the scope of landfills in the United States, this is a map of the landfills in the US. The red ones are open landfills that are currently being added to. The green ones are closed, so completely filled landfills that are not being added to anymore. So you can see landfills take up a large amount of space. You can see there are varying sizes. And so decreasing the amount of waste we're putting into landfills is important because eventually we're going to run out of space. Another issue with landfills is the methane that's produced. This is produced by the anaerobic decomposition of the organic material. Remember, anaerobic means without oxygen. And so that ends up producing methane as a waste product instead of CO2. If that methane gets released into the air, it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. But if you can pipe out that methane, that reduces the volume of stuff in the landfill, which allows you to put more solid waste. And you can combust or burn that methane and use it to produce electricity. You can pipe it out as natural gas, or you can turn it into biogas, like for vehicle fuel. All right, so those are some examples of ways to reduce our solid waste that we produce.